For having us. So the reason I love this theme, I didn't come up with it, I'm just filling in at the 4A's request. They came up with the whole idea of, RX discussion, keeping it healthy, data at the heart is. My own personal epiphany about media happened when I was in junior high school and we took two classes, one in mass media and one in hygiene. In the mass media class, we talked about McLuhan and how what we put into our brains, this thing called data or information, affected our mental health and our societal health. And then in hygiene, we studied two things. It was the early 70s. It was the time of red dye number 2 and MSG in baby food, so we learned how to read nutrition labels. And then in the other part, we were reading about ecology and Silent Spring and DDT and these things we put in the environment, how that affected our planet's health. So to me, it was all the same thing. It was data. If you put data in your brain and you became unhealthy because of it, it messed you up, it messed up society. If you put the wrong data in your body, these things we call nutrients, chemicals, it affected your physical health. If you put the wrong stuff in the environment, it affected your environmental health. So for me, media was always about this kind of garbage in, garbage out approach to data. And we're finally only here now because I think partly because we've had this programmatic infrastructure emerge and there's so much data available. But we all feel like it's sickening, it's unhealthy. Sorry, George. George is like the AMA. He's like the guy who sets the standards for what is healthy and what isn't. But we all are practitioners here. So I'd like to open it up with that theme and just ask each of you to kind of talk about how sick you think the patient is right now. And what are you doing in your organization to make it healthier? Start off with that.
Who would you like to start? Me?
Well, you're the AMA, so you're clearly...
All right. So how healthy is the patient? I think the patient is reasonably healthy, but I think that we're on the verge of maybe getting less healthy. Not that I want to be a pessimist, but what we're experiencing today is kind of a much more distributed system of data usage and reliance than we've had in the past. If you look across the products, for example, the Media Rating Council deals with, almost virtually every currency that we work with for media is in a major state of transition. We're moving towards, and this is literally very old news, but towards transactional data sets, much more oriented towards things like attribution of data, not necessarily going out and having this small controlled sample of people that you would gather intelligence from directly. And now what we're doing is we're using these larger transactional data sets, we're attributing them, we're integrating them, and we're also keeping them outside of central data repositories, and we're moving them down to closer to where the media strategy and decisioning is being made. So at the agency level and data management platforms, and everybody's got to have one, and they're spending millions of dollars on them. But not a lot of people are thinking about what we think about the data, which is that data dictates how content flows to the public. I'm looking at all of you. And as somebody who's testified in front of Congress 3 times, not because I volunteered, but because they drag you up there, and they want to know how you protect the fairness of media allocation decisions. No one's talked about that today. We want to use people's financial data. We want to use people's transactional data. Not everybody has a checking account. Less socioeconomically affluent people, they may use or create data sets differently. So we need to be thinking on a broader basis about these distributed data processes, how to validate them, how to ensure they're complete, how to understand them and what's missing from them, and how to supplement them with other data sources so that we're making fair media allocation decisions. We need to be more transparent. So all of those things we're sort of moving into a more risky environment. We used to have these old, more like, I'd say less nimble data organizations, panels, and large companies that were the repository of these data. But they protected that data. And there were people that got up every day. You can say what you want about Nielsen and Arbitron and MRI and all these companies, but there are people at those companies that get up every morning and they wonder about how that data is fair and how that data is accurate. And not everybody who's using a DMP thinks about that. So anyway, you can tell I'm passionate about this.
I can do a whole discussion with George on this topic. I'm going to follow up on that with a follow-up question, but I'd like to do quickly, how sick do you think the patient is, and what would you do right now to make it better?
Yeah, so for me, I'll take a little bit of a more optimistic view. So I think, just to stick with the metaphor, I think we've just gotten a really good diagnosis from the doctor, and we're in physical therapy. So I think...
Oh, okay. No meds, physical therapy. Good.
Yeah, no meds. But I think, I think the last couple of years have been pretty rough for the industry with the amount of fraud that's slipped in, and non-human traffic, all of those sorts of things. But I think the reason that they slipped in is because we weren't optimizing to the right thing. So I think, and we didn't have the right data to optimize to start with. So I think as agencies and advertisers get smarter about what they're driving towards with their media, so what KPI really matters to them, it's going to make it harder for the bad data to infect the system or infect our industry. So I think with the rise of cross-device, that's helping us tie together a lot of the pieces. And I think that bringing offline attribution or offline conversions online, that'll help as well. So I think as long as you have a proper signal to optimize to, you can get away, or you have a way to sniff out the bad stuff and find the good stuff.
So Amanda, you're about precision media. Talk about surgical precision.
Precision media, for us, I think we're seeing this shift from, to stick with the metaphor as well, this sugar high that we've all been on with data, right? It's more. Consume, more data is better. And that's not necessarily the case. Now we're starting to shift more to understanding kind of where the protein lies and what is the right data and how is that nutritional and how can that actually be sustainable and usable, and talk more about the quality of data instead of just asking for more and realizing it's actually not the right data to drive those decisions.
Michael, it's right there on your shirt. It's about humans. How healthy are we because of all this data?
All right, so I'll extend the metaphor by talking about how big data sets across the internet are being poisoned. And it's an outrageously hard problem because the extent of fraud can be used as a litmus test for how effectively we're using data. And I think that there was a presumption that if we just had better data and tracked to performance better, that fraud would get naturally sidelined. But one of the reasons why this crime scales and is so attractive to profit-seeking black hat hackers is that, as we've said at White Ops, the crime is coming from within the house. It's ordinary people's computers that are getting compromised, and all of the signals that we use to do targeting in this industry come from the machines that we're interacting with. So if those machines are under the control of the bad guys, and that's what a botnet is, it's a bunch of malware-compromised consumers' computers, then we end up confidently serving ads to robots because there's no distinguishing between a real user and all of the identity tokens that we have resident in the device ID or the cookie or server side and available through a data exchange, and the malware that's resident on that computer that has access to all of those tokens as well. So what we haven't seen with first-party identity data and extraordinary user intelligence is a decrease in fraud. We've actually seen the opposite because the small populations of botnet operators that don't know how to game targeting systems make almost no money, so they're economically irrelevant. It's the bots that are confidently targeted and are actually associated with conversion actions because this cookie or device ID is polluted. It's both a real person and it's being used by malware that is the cause of the multi-billion-dollar losses. So if we use that as kind of a litmus test for how healthy the big data ecosystem is, I would say that we have an endemic poisoning problem because of this built-in implicit trust in identification information that is resident on the other side, on the consumer's machine, and that's where the compromise is happening. That's where the virus is, which means that the bad guys have our data too.
Okay, so comScore recently accredited for media metrics by the MRC. You've come out of a history of panel-based measurement. You're now much more involved in tagging and actually touching people through this ecosystem. How sick do you think we are as a patient?
So I'm going to take it, blimey, that sounds bad. I'm going to take it a step further. And when you talk about how healthy the patient is, I think we need to look back at what we decide the health is. So if you go back to those of us that have been involved in digital trading for a long time, we used to buy, I come from the trading ecosystem, from the sell side. And in the olden days, when you bought sites direct, you knew exactly where your ad ran. And there's an emotional feeling of well-being when you can actually see the ad in situ. I think that the evolution of the marketplace, and it's been accelerated by programmatic, has created an environment where it all comes down to the fact that we can now spend millions and millions of dollars and never see the ad. Okay? And the whole area of trust is how healthy the patient is has now been evolved by that ecosystem. And I agree entirely with what Michael's saying, that it is that proliferation of the way that we target that's created an environment that can actually cause the illness in the first place.
But we were buying direct because it was a contextual proxy for reaching the audience. Now you actually can reach the audience, and that's the shift towards programmatic. The problem is that there's a lot of fraudulent traffic in the ecosystem, and that's what we need to clean up.
Exactly. So to go back to your initial question, how healthy is the ecosystem? I think it's the diagnosis criteria is a lot stronger than it was. Okay. But the problem is bigger than it was because of the way the market's evolved.
All right, I'll stick with the metaphor one more time, and then I'll get off of a dead horse. But so to me, when I think of that issue and the way it was framed by the 4A's, I actually go right to obesity, because I think the issue is the volume of data that we're processing, and that it's actually creating an unhealthy condition, because I think we're actually processing too much of the wrong kind of nutrients or data in the system and not enough of the right ones. And I think a lot of what we're talking about here is a function of that. We focus a lot on what is being done wrong, not on what's being done right. So we look at the negatives of non-human traffic, non-viewability. By the way, those issues have existed in media way before digital, and they continue to exist to this day. And it's a function of what we decide as an industry as to what we're measuring. And it seems like we still don't even have a consensus on how to do this part right. So going back to this obesity theme, do you think we are looking at the wrong nutrients and that we're putting too much energy on the wrong things? I said I could do a whole conversation with George on this, but the MRC was created in 1963 after the original ratings crisis by Congress and a consent decree with the Justice Department. And the idea is you, in effect, establish currencies. Is that you? Okay.
That's me. Yeah.
Right.
Somebody's calling me because they heard the term obesity and me in the same sentence.
So let me phrase this. It's important. When you approve someone for accreditation, you just did media metrics.
Yes.
I think White Ops is accredited. I'm not sure, but okay.
They're in the process.
Right. But they become currency and data that's permissible for people to use. The minute you do that, the weight that people put towards that data goes off the charts. It's now a trading currency. And if you are able to detect non-human robot traffic, then that's something we can measure, and we start to think a lot about it. Whether it's looking at direct site composition or not, the data we have determines what we look at, and what we don't have and what we don't focus at. So I guess really it's more of a question for a planning point of view, which is, are we even looking at the right data? Are we ingesting the right information? Or are we just focused on what we can see and measure?
I think that has shifted, and as an agency, what we're trying to do is take data out of the silo of a data and analytics team and bring it actually into the team that understands what are the KPIs for that client, what can we do to measure against that and hold the folks accountable and have the right verification, but have that actually at the planner-buyer level too, not just in a measurement team afterthought, so that it starts to then inform, are we actually pursuing the right target from what we've learned in the last effort? What insights can we get from trade desk on a macro level across categories? So it's seeding this from kind of a data and analytics in this siloed world, which we've heard throughout the conference today, into the actual teams that are closest to the business, that understands what drives the business, so you can start to parse out the quality of the data and read all the signals too, not just set it and forget it, but constantly be optimizing and understanding what is the quality data against what partner and how can we drive more transparency and get more of that. I think one of our shifts, though, is also the world of, as our clients get their first-party data act together more, that becomes powerful versus this reliance on the modeled third-party data, which is where a lot of the junk food is.
All right.
Yeah, I would just add that I think it is a matter of figuring out which data set, so as an advertiser, which data sets or which users are the most important to you. Make sure that they're online so that you can use those as your signal to go find places to go market.
So I think one of the problems that we're really talking about here is that certain data has gotten elevated where it could be programmatically processed, and that leads to an exchange, right? But there's always been an infinite amount of data that agencies, brands, or middlemen could process to get to that answer, right? So as the last metaphor I'll use, it's a different one, but some years ago, astrophysicists had weighed and measured the entire universe, a few years back, and they concluded that 99% of it is something we can't see, measure, or know or feel or know anything about. It's called dark matter or dark energy. And I think the media universe is kind of like that too. We only can actually see a small part. I don't know if it's 1%, George would actually know the answer to that, or 50%, but there's a lot we don't see. But we attribute everything we do based on what we see about the universe. And so my question is really, are we even looking at the right data here? We know that fraud and non-human traffic is real, so obviously you have to track that, and it's a really important part of the ecosystem. Are we putting too much weight on the fact that 50% of the traffic is fraudulent or something like that, and not looking, at the 50% that is reaching human beings and figuring out better ways of understanding those connections?
I mean,
Go ahead, sir.
I think that's a really good question. The world I live in, a lot of the data out there is kind of dark to us because it's proprietary.
Right.
So one of the points I made initially is that practice is growing. The data is being pushed down more towards the strategic decision making, which is a good thing. I wasn't pushing back on that. You see agencies managing their own data. I was only throwing out a caution. But if you look at the world that I do live in, which is third-party data, measurement company data, data that's syndicated, let's say. We have a strategy. You ask a really big question, so I'm going to concentrate on digital. There is a strategy there. We're setting a foundation. We wanted to seize control a little bit of the digital currency and figure out how to manage it better rather than just let it meander along. So we wanted to first make it viewable. We published non-human traffic, invalid traffic standards, and we're trying to credit vendors for sophisticated invalid traffic. We published social media standards about engagement and how to do that. We're working on viewability for mobile. We're now, all this is coming to a focal point, which is converting the currency in digital to audience-based currency, which is away from, just say gross impression transactions through an ad server. Not to say it's not important, but audience decisions to a human, in target, that is viewable. That's it. That's where we're moving. And by the way, when I say audience, I don't just mean age and gender. It could be any kind of characteristic that might be in a brand's target group. That is the overall strategy. We've been executing on that for 3 years. We're mired in viewability wars, of course, because that's a big transition. But that's the goal. We're trying to get people to focus on essentially that 50% that you're talking about, removing all the noise from it, concentrate on that.
So that's reassuring. We know the currencies are good and well rated. So the question is really for the rest of the panel, which is, are we even looking at the right currencies, the right data, and are we applying them in the right way?
I'm confident that we're not. I'm not confident if I might. Listen, White Ops is a white hat hacking team. We're not a team of data scientists, And there are a tremendous number of big companies with awesome data science teams and first-party identity info. There's Google and Facebook and Twitter and Yahoo and AOL. And when we find fraud that has slipped past those guys, I don't come in and say, we do better data science than you. Of course we don't. What we have is data that they were completely missing because of our ability to take on the black hats. And it's worth examining how the black hats are succeeding at scale against amazing data science. And part of the reason why this crime scales is that there's this fundamental value proposition around audience-based targeting that says, listen, sure, you could pay this expensive rate and get the audience that's visiting the New York Times, but I can deliver you the same people when they're over at these blogs at like 1/10 of the price. It's going to be awesome, and it's the same people we know for sure. And the way that value proposition works is based on having confidence in the persistence of usually cookies, sometimes browser fingerprints, some server-side fingerprints, some device IDs, but fundamentally it's trust and identity tokens that are being actively manipulated by now very large botnets at scale. So what that means is that a relatively small percentage of U.S. households with infected computers, right now about half of today's ad fraud profits are going to come from just 3% of U.S. households with the freshest malware infection. That is the small percentage of infections that are broadly uncaught by the other defense mechanisms in this ecosystem, at networks or analytics companies or what have you. And to punch above their weight, to have a cost impact that's at least triple that, they need to look highly targetable. So we're not playing against like a noise floor or just some inefficiencies. We're playing against active counterparties who are actively trying to undermine all of the signals of success in this ecosystem. It's a new form, really, of identity theft. Right now, the way identity theft pays off is because you steal a credit card. But the value of a credit card, a newly stolen credit card on the black market, is $1. The lifetime value of that 3% of U.S. households that are infected across the several months that they're going to go undetected is tens of dollars. So the payout is substantially higher. And when you infect new machines, your EV across your entire botnet is like $100. So it's an extremely compelling crime that has therefore attracted the best.
Okay,
business.
that's bad, and you guys are fixing it. So that's good. So let's look at a different part of the, because we're supposed to be talking about all
Can I
the
just
data.
go back to that point? Okay,
Go ahead.
the last question. The last 3 or 4 years, we started off worrying about brand safety and the implications of brands appearing against the wrong environment. Then we all started to talk about viewability and all the nuances involved in there. And then latterly, in the last couple of years, it's been all about fraud. The truth of the matter is they're all intrinsically linked, right? Sophisticated fraud impacts on viewability rates, et cetera, et cetera.
That's where the money is.
The point being that it's been a negative connotation. It's been how bad the problem is. And the contentious point here is that pretty much every business model in the trading ecosystem is affected by this. There's transparency. It's important, and it affected it. And there's been a lot of, I guess, ostrich mentality towards it. But there's also been a choice of picking the vendors and working with people that effectively protect the status quo. To my mind, the future of verification and identifying this traffic is exactly your point. It's actually a perfect vehicle to find the stuff that's actually doing the work. Okay? And if we can accept that the numbers are lower than where we want them to be and optimize against the stuff that's actually doing the work, the return on the investment is incremental. It's huge. And that's the big step change, to my mind, that the market needs to go through, is to accept where we are and optimize against what I'd like to refer to as the verified impression, because the return on investment is so much greater. But it's a hard pill to swallow, and it's taking a long time, and the market needs to move away from how bad the problem is to understanding that the tools exist and they are becoming increasingly sophisticated to actually tackle this and work on optimizing towards the stuff that's actually doing the work.
So the good news is the industry is moving in another direction that will reduce this problem because we're not relying on cookies anymore to the full extent. We're now building unique IDs about the total user experience, including their devices. And so now when you target a consumer, you're not just looking at those cookie-based profiles anymore. So the real trick here is in assembling the best coverage of unique IDs in the world so that you can target those consumers with more assurance. That is something hackers will figure out how to get into at some point. So right now, the most powerful entities in the business are the ones that have the most comprehensive unique profiles, right? So it'd be like Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon. And you as an organization, and I think probably you as an organization, probably all of you at some, except for the MRC, want to amass the greatest profiles of those users so you could get away from targeting them on the basis of cookie-based impressions. How is that going to help make the business more healthy? Will it move us away from the lack of confidence we have over and a reduced reliance on cookie-based impressions?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the biggest topics in our industry is the world of walled gardens, which seem to be proliferating, seem to be getting even less porous. And how can we start to change that perspective so that we can find that right audience across all the major players instead of moving from one to another and not being able to actually match up what are the identifiers across them? That is, I think, what we see is holding the industry back as well, if we continue to operate in this walled garden world.
Well, how far are we along that path? Because all of the traders I speak with say they are now using everything. Location, they are using the apps loaded on your phone to target you, all of these other mechanisms that are moving away from cookie-based impressions. How far downstream are we? Are we still pretty much reliant on this ecosystem that Michael and Duncan were talking about?
Yeah, I don't see a step change improvement in the evolution of the primitive of identification, because the vulnerability is that if that primitive can be accessed by the hackers, then it can't be trusted.
Well, yeah, but everything can be accessed by a hacker. A digital out-of-home billboard, a newspaper.
Okay. Exactly. Yes. Right.
Yes, that's a constant game of warfare, and you have to it's an arms race, and you constantly have to be on top of it. And thank God there's white ops type people in the world to do that. But what I'm saying is, isn't there better data out there that we should be moving upstream toward and getting away from? It seems to me like I'm at a conference where there's a panel discussion today on fraudulent traffic, and I was covering fraudulent traffic my first week on the job at Adweek. It actually involved an agency that I will not mention got caught bilking its clients for $40 million in syndication credits that never ran. So it's not unheard of. That goes on in every part of the business, okay? The trick is for people to catch fraud, stop it, prevent the process. But my question is, are we looking at the right data? Are we even, I think the patient's ill because we're looking at the worst parts of the business, really.
But the problem is that if you have a crystal ball of perfect data that can match to your purchase history, and targeting is based on the actual offline purchases that you make, and you have malware on your computer, that malware is a copy of you, and so the fraud's going to persist.
It's a factor, it's a vector in the whole thing.
One thing we haven't talked about is mobile. So
Yeah.
the whole mobile environment is evolving in a way that's not cookie reliant. And that's unignorable, Joe. So
Could that be a good thing?
That's a good thing. In my opinion, it's a good thing. I think it's forcing a transition, to non-cookie reliant process that other environments, like the desktop environments that we usually deal in, are learning from.
It seems to me like we've been working with proxies that represent the consumer, whether it was Nielsen ratings or MRI in the old days, or cookie-based DMPs in these days, to actually connecting directly to the user. And with that device, or triangulating devices, like you're starting to do now through Axiom and other companies, or working with Google or Facebook, if they'll tell you who that user was, you can get more precisely about who the users are. And when you're in that environment, does it reduce those? I mean, yeah, hackers will hack into everything, but are you getting closer?
Can I just make, because you mentioned these big environments. The one thing is, not too long ago, the ANA issued a white paper really a call to action for large, what we call walled garden environments to allow third-party measurement.
Right.
And I think they've been successful in that. The major third-party walled garden environments are opening themselves up. Now, they're taking baby steps.
Okay.
But like, if you look at Google and you look at Twitter and you look at Facebook, all of those organizations are now in beta with Moat to allow third-party tagging for measurement of viewability. That's an unprecedented step. And coming to fruition, supposedly this quarter, this calendar quarter, will be a Moat-enabled tag in those environments to execute viewability while protecting the consumer. I think the gentleman up here in the last panel from Facebook said, we have to protect the consumer. So that's what, I'm enthusiastic about that.
It's mobile and display attribute to those users' unique IDs through those walled gardens.
It is, and it's executed by a third-party vendor. And my hope is that it's the beginning step of other third-party vendors being enabled. We have, for example, comScore in the room here, and I don't sell for comScore, but they do measure, and they wake up every morning trying to figure out how to measure the best they can, and that I like.
I think to your question, Joe, there isn't an answer to are we tracking and looking at the right data at this macro level. It's what's right in the eyes of what drives that KPI for that client.
Right.
So that's where I think as a business we need to get more comfortable with hypotheses and test and test and test and continue to optimize against that versus a statement, a singular point of view that can be applied universally.
Right, but if we're optimizing against non-human traffic or viewability, that's the outcome you're going to get. Oh, that's a question I'm supposed to ask because John Picone reminded me of that. In a way, are we focusing on the wrong outcomes? And should we start to be looking at the data that shows that when you ran this ad, regardless of whether there was a non-human or a human, what did the return on that investment actually generate? Is that also a possible thing? I guess what I'm saying is, if we just focus on the percentage of viewability, it's the GRP or CPM question, like you could pay twice as much to reach a 100% viewable audience, or pay less money and get some unviewable audience, but you're still going to get the effective outcome.
So I did a presentation last year at New Mexico, and I was talking about sophisticated non-human traffic and its effect on viewability and extrapolating out before you calculate it. And at the end of it, an unnamed agency, head of the digital division, came up to me with their client and said, our client's been pushing very heavily for an increase in viewability. Okay? And we've been using a vendor, and we've managed to increase our viewability rate by nearly 30% over a quarter.
Right.
And we've been delighted with it. But this particular vendor, and they'll go unnamed, doesn't take out fraud before they calculate the viewability. Okay. And the net result was, because of that single chasing of the KPI of getting viewability rates high, because in its essence, that's a very easy thing to understand. I want my ads to be seen. Their cost per acquisition had gone up dramatically. Because what they'd actually been doing, and the bots themselves that Michael referred to, they're intelligent, right? They don't just serve ads below and above the fold. They scroll, and they mimic dwell time, and they mimic human behavior. So that chasing that single KPI without extrapolating sophisticated fraud had actually ended up netting out as a negative because they'd increased their percentage of the traffic to bots. And it was a bit of a light bulb moment for this particular chap, that it is all intrinsically linked.
We've seen the same thing.
All right, I think we have time for a question or two from the audience, if anybody wants. David.
Sure, yeah.
All right, you're the man. David Kaplan.
Thank you so much for your marketing. I was wondering about if anyone could talk about the role of geodata sort of influencing the conversation, whether it's fraud, is that maybe easier, or is that something that is more difficult to, assign, bots to? Anyone?
Yeah.
There is so much fakery happening in geotargeting. It's unreal because so much mobile targeting turns out to actually be geotargeting that you can make your ad inventory look way more valuable by faking geodata to a higher degree of precision than you really have it. It's happening across the board. Astonishing.
And I think it's the same thing we've been talking about. So there's definitely fraud in it, but if you have the right KPI, you're optimizing to the right things, you can kind of sniff out what's the bad stuff and optimize towards what's the good stuff.
Yeah, I've been told that the sexiest data right now for agencies and brands to look at is geo data and the app composition or the app install data on the user's device. And then when you know those two things, you could know a lot more about them than their cookie-based behaviors.
Definitely a source of input, but that has started to surface across partners, like what is real when it comes to geo. To your point, you have to run it, you have to see and optimize against that. But clearly it's a big part of conquesting strategies, and clients love that idea of moving someone from their competitor's parking lot to their own store by knowing that location.
Great. Michael Koshansky, Havas Media. Quick question. So as we move away from cookie-based targeting to device-based targeting, with cookies, technically you can opt out, right, and not be tracked as a consumer. But when you think about unifying those IDs across a device, consumers can't really opt out of device-level tracking.
No, they opted in when they signed up the end-user license agreement that put them in that device pool in the first place, the unique ID.
Well, right, but
Right.
I don't think most people actually even review that, right? So my point is,
right.
my point is, from a consumer privacy standpoint, in perpetuity at this point, as long as that individual has that device and links to other devices, you're now targeting them. So what is MRC's kind of point of view on that sort of tracking, passive versus kind of active?
We don't think like signing a license agreement when you acquire a device 3 years ago holds water for that. And as a matter of fact, when we're in app environments and we're looking at app level measurement, we look at the prominence and presence of the opt-out mechanism. Now the truth is, very few people use it, even if it's prominent. At that level, you've kind of cornered the market because people don't mind sharing certain information if they're energized about that concept. They're really into it. And when you're in, let's say, the walled garden of an app and somebody's already into that app, they very, very infrequently opt out. But when we do look at that environment and we write standards in that environment, it says you should have a prominent opt-out. It should be relatively current,
And you
So
do
we
that
don't-
for ethical reasons, not for engineering reasons.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good question.
Having said that, we should be looking at the positive glass half full, looking at the work. I've come up personally up against feedback that this is a dual-edged sword as well, where there are nefarious apps out there, and no one reads the T's and C's, but in the T's and C's, you're actually allowing that app to become a push marketing tool for fraud. So it is a double-edged
So
sword.
let me ask a question. I mean, another connection to J. Walter Thompson and Mindshare and Group M was that they've led this whole piracy thing, that they won't buy any pirated traffic. Can the industry take a position on this, that you won't buy data, in effect, or trade on data if it hasn't reached some standard of permissible use from the user post this ELUA that you signed up for when you installed that app? Would you guys get behind that at an agency?
Isn't that part of the TAG initiative that's
It
happening?
is, yeah, the trustworthy.
So there,
Yeah.
so obviously you support
Exactly,
that.
that as an industry, can we support this
So
at
you
all
do put your
levels of
dollars-
not buying, who's not on the white list?
I don't think it's been fully operationalized, Joe, but TAG is writing traffic source standards. They're trying to get the industry to sign off on, some implicit endorsement of
It's the Trustworthy
being transparent.
Accountability
Yeah,
Group.
Trustworthy Accountability Group. And we coordinate with them pretty
There are
extensively.
steps. Okay. Any other questions? So, Jane Clark.
Jane Clark from SIM. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the data quality issue from a lot of the third-party data sources, and these a lot of them grow out of the direct marketing industry. They're not familiar with the kind of auditing and accreditation that occurs in media buying. Just any thoughts about how big an issue that is, or any solutions?
So I can speak to this one. Just so from our platform perspective, we want to open our door to any third-party data provider that wants to integrate with us. And what we feel our job is to help clients find the right third-party data provider. So if someone integrates with us and they're passing us data that's just not high quality, or it's not what they say it is, we need to create tools that allow our clients to go figure out what's the good stuff, what's the bad stuff. And then I think kind of harping back to the fraud discussion as well, I think having the right optimization metric can help also right the course. So if you do come across third-party data that just isn't what it's marked up to be, as long as you're optimizing towards the right thing, if you're putting your ad in front of the wrong users, then it should come out in the wash. You should see that through the data and be able to find what you need.
Tools are a big part of that process, though, right? And I think that's an area of evolution, too, where the platforms that have kind of defined who the audience is as yes and checkbox, but not the opportunity to really understand what the no's are as well, and how to make that more seamless as the teams at the junior levels are getting in these tools and platforms and defining audiences, understanding the data that matches to that, and you surfacing where it's trouble or not before we even see it.
Totally.
One of the most interesting things that's happened to us recently, this is only in the last couple weeks, well, actually for months now, we've been in discussions with a large company that is essentially a data warehouse. So if you think of large data warehouse companies that have the identities of everybody in the United States, they came to us some time ago and they said, hey, what we're seeing is increased demand for our data. People want to link with our data, attribute our data, use this as a source for linking disparate media data sets, things like that. We think that that's a great thing, but we want to be legitimized. So will the MRC accredit, not a metric, but accredit us as a data provider? So it would be a new type of thing, just like we could accredit this data set for certain quality. Is it transparent? Where the data came from? The data recency, error rates, etc. The dynamic nature of the data. A lot of the considerations that's there. We thought it was intriguing, so we've been in discussions because audits don't turn on a dime. You got to figure out what you're going to audit, what standards, and all that stuff. That organization has now applied for accreditation.
Wow.
And
Who is that?
I can't say. But it would be a pretty big new thing that you could say, hey, this data source is transparent, validated. Now, all you guys out there, at least you know what you get there. Maybe you should be encouraged to use it. I think my hope is that would be a growing trend. I don't make any money off of audits. In fact, audits are bad for me because I don't get it's a terrible business model I have, but it's great for the industry.
That's good.
Man, if you've ever seen one of those audits, they're
big.
thick.
But George, I'm curious, are there kind of if the question was always, do you have data and can you share your data, which it was for the last 2 years, and now we've got it, what do we do with it? Do you have your kind of list of 5 questions that you would make sure folks are asking? What is your update policy and what's the cadence of refreshing your data?
We do. We have all that. That's why we've been working on this for months. And we don't have to recreate the wheel. I mean, Jane asked a question about this, but SIM has done a lot of work on data quality. I'm sure you're aware of that. We don't have to recreate it. Plus, we have our own. We have data integration guidelines and testing and validation. But how do you determine how good is good with a data set? It's not that easy. It's kind of like, how do you determine how much sophisticated invalid traffic detection is good? Or boil the ocean. I mean, it's really tough.
Can I use this as a closing question? Because my view has always been it's a buyer beware marketplace, that there are accredited things, there are permissible things, there are best practices things, and then there's anything you want to use. Nobody accredits first-party data. I feel good about my first-party data. It may be good, bad, or indifferent data, but I use it. Is it a buyer's beware marketplace? Is this a data marketplace where people should be able to pick and choose at will? Or should we only be working with industry-sanctioned things?
It works against me, but I don't think you can just work with industry-sanctioned things. I think it'd be short-sighted. I think all the agency people out there and marketers, they want you to leverage the assets you have, as the gentleman said who opened up the session. It's how you differentiate yourself. But there's a certain level of base data that's like the standard of truth. You shouldn't work with that data unless it's accredited.
And clearly, if it's fraudulent bot traffic, it's bad. Do not work with it.
Big takeaway.
Well, that was interesting. I think we could have had 3 different conversations on this panel today, but I liked all the ground we covered. I don't know if... Oh, let me ask, what is the prognosis?
Exactly. Getting healthier.
Well, it
Not a
was
life
health,
sport.
healthy and heart. Okay, all right. Are we good? Do we still want to go? Do you do these things?
He's going like this.
We're done. Okay, thank you.
A day in the grave is going on.